Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video and welcome to episode 9 of the Underdogs of Raiding. Today we're going to be talking about a spec that I'm not that familiar with, even less familiar than the Retribution Paladin, and that is its tanking counterpart, the Protection Paladin. So, as always, let's jump back into 2004 and see where things start for the Protection Paladin. In the early stages of vanilla, it's fairly well known that leveling as a Paladin was quite rough. They didn't do a whole lot of damage to begin with, and the fact that like the warrior they were quite gear dependent didn't really do them any favors. That being said though, while Retribution looked like the main way to do damage, and thus the go-to spec for leveling at first glance, throughout the lifespan of Vanilla WoW people realized that leveling up as a Protection Paladin wasn't that bad either, especially in the later stage of the game. A nice one-hander with a shield would actually provide you with a stable source of DPS, and the addition of a few spells would help you along the way. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's look at the original talent tree that Paladins had to work with. And here it is. And just look at its magnificence. First of all, we find that Consecration was in the Retribution tree. Yeah, remember how Consecration is amazing for prot Paladins for both damage and some extra threat during packs of mobs? Well, here it is in the Retribution tree, so tough luck. You can't have it until a much later level. Another odd thing was that Anticipation, which would give you 5% dodge, was also in the Retribution tree. Again, a talent that was more protection-like that wasn't in the Protection tree. Then we have a look at the top talent in the Protection tree, which was Repentance. You see just how many talents are in a completely different order. Later down the line, Repentance is the top talent for Retribution, yet here it is in the Protection tree. So, like I said before the talent trees, leveling up with a decent one-hander and a shield wasn't too bad of a way to level up, but because the talents were so out of whack, it was kinda hard to really make it work. But that will be solved in a later stage of the game. Speaking of which, let's jump ahead to the later stage of Vanilla WoW where we find this talent tree. This is where things are starting to make a little bit more sense. Now we have Holy Shield as our last talent, which makes much more sense. Consecration is in the Holy Tree, but luckily it's way earlier in the tree compared to the early stages of Vanilla. Anticipation, which gave you 5% dodge, is thankfully in the Protection tree, and Blessing of Kings is also there for that extra stat boost. All in all, things were starting to look up for the Protection Paladins, and especially on private servers, people really started to tap into the potential of what the spec could offer. In this stage of the game, Protection Paladins were quite good in leveling up with some right gear. They were strong in solo grinding, both while leveling and doing dungeons, mainly because you're able to do some AoE farming with the combination of Consecration, Retribution Aura, and Reckoning should you have that talent. They can also do some trash farming in Dire Maul to rack up some cash on private servers, and a cool thing that I learned from Drakova is that the 8-piece set of tier 1, which is Lawbringer, makes for a pretty sweet tanking set. I mean, sure, it doesn't have any defense rating, but you can actually do some decent tanking in dungeons with this, because the 8 set bonus of this tier 1 set gives you a chance to heal the entire party with every melee hit you do. And since you're tanking, you're using melee hits all the time. Matter of fact, Paladins are considered to be quite decent in tanking 5-man dungeons if played properly and if they have the right gear. There's actually a very comprehensive tanking guide on the Elysium forum if anyone's interested in checking it out. Of course though, Paladin tanks weren't perfect. Their biggest problem was, well, warriors. Warriors were simply better tanks, and in pretty much every raid they were outshined by them simply because they were better at holding aggro and had more defensive capabilities like shield wall for instance. That and the lack of any real Protection Paladin gear. You see, the ideal gear for Protection Paladins was plate gear with lots of stamina of course, spell damage for threat, and defense rating, and unfortunately there's barely anything like that in Vanilla WoW. No, in raids Paladins were almost always forced to go holy, besides the odd Retribution Paladin. I'm looking at you, Esfand. So all in all, the Vanilla era was interesting to say the least. They can work as a way to level up, and if you know how to play one, they can be decent in 5-man dungeons, but when it came to endgame raiding, they just weren't really up to snuff. But not all is lost for Paladin tanks, because we're moving on to the next era of the game, which had some big plans for them. So here we are at the Burning Crusade era, and this is now the talent tree Paladins could mess around with. The Protection Paladins got a few extra goodies to play with, including Ardent Defender for reduced damage by 30% when you drop below 35% health, 16% extra stamina from the talents Sacred Duty and Combat Expertise, and their top talent was Avenger Shield, which meant Paladins now had a great opener to pull packs of mobs and get some decent threat on multiple targets. Not only did the talent tree really help them a long way, now they also had a lot of gear available with stats they needed, including separate tier sets like all the other classes, which meant they could really focus on the stats they needed in order to be a good Paladin tank. So, how were they? Well, in the Burning Crusade, they were giving them warriors a real run for their money. Matter of fact, prot paladins were in some cases preferred for tanking, because with consecration and a lot of extra threat generated from holy spells, they were actually really good in AoE tanking stuff, which allowed classes like the Warlock and the Mage to go crazy on the DPS meter. Speaking of AoE tanking, I can make a video about the Protection Paladin and not show some clips from WoW Hops, a guy who made some videos of him doing lower level dungeons on his Paladin on YouTube that went viral, and I wouldn't be surprised if this guy was responsible for many Paladins trying out the protection tree and trying to do the same thing Hobbs was doing. Seriously, this guy is remembered and praised by a lot of people, and rightfully so, because he was basically showing how he farms gold and boosts people by doing lower level dungeons, which resulted in one of his videos getting almost 2.5 million views. If anyone showed the potential of Paladins in the Burning Crusade era, it's probably Hobbs, and I can't thank him enough for that. Even as someone who never touched the Paladin class in retail Burning Crusade, because I was more of a druid shaman type of guy, I thought it was really cool to watch those videos, so a big shout out to Hobbs and his awesome videos. So back to the Protection Paladin itself. They did have some more competition because now feral druids were considered solid tanks as well, but they could definitely hold their own, and seeing a Paladin tanks in raids went from being a complete head scratcher to kind of an everyday thing, from random heroics all the way to Sunwell Plateau, which was a huge step into the right direction for the Protection Paladin. It probably doesn't surprise you to know that the Burning Crusade era was a really good time for the Protection Paladin, and things were starting to get even better. Because now we arrive at the Wrath of the Lich King era of the game, and for this era, I'm gonna need some help. You see, while I do know a few things about the Protection Paladin in Vanilla and the Burning Crusade, I know pretty much nothing about them in the Wrath of the Lich King era. This is the only Paladin I got, and he's Retribution, and even with that spec, my knowledge is very limited. So while I was writing the script for this part of the video, I asked my friend Stepparn for some advice on the Protection Paladin, and after some talking I decided, you know what? You might as well be a guest on the video itself. So, who is Stepparn? Well, if you've ever seen my Gamer District review, he's the guy who helped me a lot by offering me to join one of his ICC runs. He actually helped me before with some other Underdog of Raiding episodes, and I have to thank him for the sweet gear I have on my 80 Moonkin as well. So, without further ado, here's Stepparn on the Protection Paladin in Wrath of the Lich King and how it compares to the other tank classes in the game.
Alright, well, I'm Stepparn from Gamer District, and I've been raiding for like 2.5 years, 3 years, so I'm an officer in Enigma, so I've had to go through a lot of tanks, and I know which tank's going to be the best, or the most all-round tank. And yeah, Prot Paladin's definitely like, it's the easiest tank, it's not really the easiest tank to play, but it's the most beginner-friendly, because like, Blood DKs, which is one of the most viable tanks are like Feral Tank, Prot Paladin, and Blood DK. Blood DK requires a lot of management with the runes to get maximum threat, and it's like really window based. Like they won't have threat for a certain window, and then they'll have loads of threat for like a small window. Feral Tank, the only real downside they have is because they have rage. So if the fight doesn't have taunting, like they're taunt immune, once they lose aggro and then they have to take aggro back, like on Lady Death Whisper, they're not the best because their threat's limited then because they're rage starved basically. So they rely really heavily on good rogues and hunters, which is hard to come by because they find it difficult to switch target every 30 seconds. And then Paladin doesn't have either of the issues, so they have good consistent threat, which is only limited by mana, but they don't really have that issue in raids anyway. They only have the mana issues outside of raids, where they don't get hit very much. They have really good threat, they can reduce threat in the raid, they have 2 taunts, one of them does damage, which is rare, so it does even more threat than normal taunts would. Then they also have a ranged AoE slow that also silences, so you can use it as an interrupt. One of the shortest cooldown long stuns in the game. The best passive cooldown in the game. They also have Feral Tank has 12% consistent damage reduction, and Warrior has 10% consistent damage reduction. Blood DK has like a damage reduction below a certain health threshold. Paladin has the same, like a damage reduction below threshold, but also has 6% flat damage reduction on top, and then another 3% from Divine Plea. So that they have the most damage reduction in the game, I think, collectively. On most fights, if you like compare basically it's a fight between, in my opinion, Blood DK and Prot Paladin, and I just think Prot Paladin brings a lot more in most fights, because if shit hits the fan, Prot Paladin doesn't die because Ardent procs. Whereas if a tank does die, like a Blood DK, there's no buffer right there to like help the raid recover. They're really easy to tank on, to be honest. A lot of people are scared of Paladins because they've got so many abilities. You only need to have a couple of them bound to actually be like considered decent. You don't have to have like every single spell you could ever see on the bar bound. They're really easy to play. And they have probably the best early game threat alongside Warriors. I mean, I think tanking on Wrath is really... I think everyone should tank at least once. Like, a lot of DPS, like, they'll play the game and they'll be like, they don't have raid frame, so they won't do something crucial. And it's like, if you just played a healer or a tank, you'd understand instantly why it's so crucial to have those things.
So, dude, thanks again so much. I'll be logging off, and you'll see this video sooner or later.
Alright, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Alright, no problem, man. Have a good one.
Alright, have a good one. Cheers.
And there you go, guys. A bit of a summary of what protection Paladins were like in the Wrath of the Lich King era. As explained by Stepparn, they were very competitive because of excellent threat, being very easy to pick up and play, and having numerous defensive capabilities that were sometimes better than what the other tank classes could offer. And now I think it's time to wrap this episode up. As we've just seen, the Protection Paladin had humble beginnings. They were outshined by Warriors, but were, if played properly, somewhat decent tanks in 5-man dungeons. But once the Burning Crusade came out, the ball, or bubble in this case, started rolling, and they became even stronger in the Wrath of the Lich King era. It became a spec that gave the other classes a serious run for their money. A spec that started out as an underdog, and 3 years later was considered a top dog. And there you go, guys, the Underdogs of Raiding episode about the Protection Paladin. I hope I was able to do this class and spec justice, as this is the most unfamiliar spec for me, but it was fun researching the class and getting to know them a bit more in the time that I was making this video. I'll be back very soon with a new episode, but until then, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel, and have a good one.